Hi there, it's Kevin with the Rogue Deck Builder here with a sort of a analysis video slash rant video about the current state of Standard 2022. Now, before I jump right into this rant, let me give a preface saying that I actually don't mind this standard nearly as much as the previous standard or some of the standards in the not so recent past. However, I do think that this standard is really dominated by powerful cards, and it's dominated by the extreme ends of aggro decks or kind of curve decks. And then we have the take extra turn dragon decks. And typically I like to see in standard is a mid-range deck. And right now we don't really have a mid-range deck. In fact, I like standards that are dominated by mid-range. Mid-range decks that are 50% across the board. Those are typically the ones that I like. People complain about the Siege Rhino years, but those type of standards, you have a lot of options available to combat those mid-range decks. You can play like a control deck that can outvalue it. You can play an aggro deck that can do it underneath it. You can play a synergy deck that can just out-synergize, I guess would be the right word, the mid-range decks. You can play a combo deck that might find a hole around that mid-range deck. And that's typically the standards I like, where the dominant one is going to be the mid-range deck, and then people try to combat it, but it's still pretty good across the board. And right now, again, we are just really dominated by powerful cards and curves. We have some of the best creatures ever printed in standard at the moment. We have some of the best removal ever printed, and it feels more draw dependent, like, ooh, do I get the right curve out of my opening hand than really, playing that tit for tat game versus your opponent. So let's just take a look at the meta, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So right now we have the number one deck being mono green aggro. Let's go back here and see a snapshot of the meta. Now, Goldfish isn't the best site to use for meta analysis because they're scrapping data from some weird tournaments, as well as they only get the one finish from the 5-0. So how Wizards does is they just release one of a deck, and no matter if it was dominated by like 30 5-0 finishes by a particular deck, it's just going to show up one time. So it skews the data a little bit, but this does give us a nice little snapshot. And the three decks that have been dominating since rotation have been mono green aggro, mono white aggro, and Is It Dragons. And it's been very tough for people to kind of break out of these shells. They just keep coming back because they're just solid decks with solid cards. Quite boring though, and that's kind of my problem with standard at the moment, is it's just very, very boring with these curve-based decks, or the take all the turns, or just play Goldspan Dragon type deck. Now, there are cards that I do wish they would ban. I don't think they are going to ban some of these cards. So instead of saying banning cards, I think that I would like to see 10 cards that were in standard that help us with combat these type of strategies. So first of all, there's mono green aggro and mono white aggro. They're very similar. They are just curve decks. They are the traditional curve decks. In fact, this deck reminds me a lot of the beginning years of Modern, where there was a mono green stompy deck that just wanted to go 1, 2, 3, 4 curve, win the game. Back it up with some removal spells slash things like Snakeskin Veil to protect their cards, and then and maybe some like cards that also do help you outvalue. And this is what mono green aggro is trying to do. Every one of these cards can get bigger, or they're ramping out into their 4-drops. So if you look at the pack leader, it's just a solid 2/1 that can get a little bit bigger. You have 2 of these mana dorks that are very flexible, a 2/2 that they can attack in or untap snowlands, then Tingle Thorhide that can be used as and these two, they come and go depending on the meta. So this particular deck is trying to ramp in their 4-drop quicker than the dragon decks are going to be able to stop them, because both their 4-drops are very good against the removal spells of Is It Dragon. So that's what they're doing at this particular deck. The flavor of the week will change in this mono green aggro, whether they need to combat the mono white shells or they need to outvalue some more of the heavier control based decks. But typically speaking, the next part of this deck has been very consistent. The Werewolf Pack Leader is one of the best 2-drops ever printed. It can draw you cards. It can pump itself. The Ilgo Troll is often a 2-for-1. Well, it usually is a 2-for-1. Again, it's a 4/4 for 3 mana. Very aggressive. And the Wolfmold Oddity, a 4/4 trample haste. And then if you do get up to 7 mana, can really pump your other creatures. But really, it's just that 4/4 trample haste for 4 mana. There's usually always one that's printed. We had the Questing Beast, the last standard, which actually ended up not seeing much play by the end of it. So we do have a power level that's definitely lower than the previous standard. However, it still is very high power level in the scope of things. A lot of these decks, I think, could compete in Modern, in the early days of Modern. That's how much the power creep has, especially with creatures and removal, has gone up since Wizards of the Coast continues to kind of push the envelope with the creatures. So this deck, again, follows it up with things like Blizzard Brawl, values with Esika's Chariot, Rangers class that can often be 2-for-1s, 3-for-1s with how much value they get. And this unnatural growth comes and goes. Sometimes it's people play it, sometimes they don't. But the kind of the name of the game with Standard too is we have these aggro strategies that are backed up with things like Faceless Haven and the lands that can be animated from the Forgotten Realms. And so that makes it very difficult for mid-range and control-based shells to kind of compete with these aggros, because you have to spend so much resources stopping this early aggression, and then you have these freebies that can just turn into, I mean, there's very little downside. These are very good lands in the scope of things. Again, some of the best lands ever printed, man lands ever printed, that they have access to. And depending on the week, you see like the Ren and 7 type strategies that will come in here for like a go bigger type strategies. And you can kind of look at some of these other mono green aggros and see how they're, how they are played, but very similar shells with at least the World Pack Leader into like your 4-drops, your Isika's Chariots, and this is how the decks are going. Mono white is very similar. It's just trying to curve, so it's going in from a 1-drop into a 2-drop, and people can decide on their 1-drop. Some people use the one where a card get exiled, it gets +1, it gets a +1/+1 countered. This one's going with the Hopeful Initiate and the Usher of the Fallen. You can kind of pick your 1-drops, but then this next part is very similar for what Mono White's doing with the Intrepid Adversary, then pumps your creatures with Luminarchus Aspirant that's going to get bigger and bigger, give another creature bigger and bigger with Thalia that can slow down your opponent's spells. And then we have the Adeline that's going to go wide. And then we have the kind of the crux of the deck, kind of the whole point of the deck with these Brutal Cathar, Elite Spellbinder, and the Skyclave Apparition that are going to tempo out your opponent on that pivotal turn 3 and hopefully then close out the game. Again, these are followed up with things like Cave of the Frost Dragon and Faceless Haven to give them more range and make it so that you get freebies out of your lands. And this is just a typical curve-based deck that is going to get as much value as possible. And I actually don't think that these are the two Boogeyman decks. I think you could actually make mid-range decks that go quite good against these decks. The deck that I think is the boogeyman of the format is going to be the Is It Dragon / Is It Take every turn, because this deck is just miserable to play against if you are going to be a combo-based deck, if you're going to be a control deck, if you're going to be a mid-range deck, if you're going to be a synergy deck. This is a deck that's going to get you, because it is just one of those time clock decks that if they get up to 7 mana, you are going to lose the game. They're going to duplicate their turns. They're going to take a billion turns, or even just a couple turns with Alan's Epiphany, then animating a Hall of the Storm Giants, oftentimes just wins the game. And so it depends on how many dragons you want to use in this. Some run none, some go on a higher package of it. There are many ways to build this, but it's typically the same deck that people are running with the value engines of the Memory Deluge and the Expressive Iteration, two of the best cards printed in a long time as far as these tempo-based draw cards. We have the Hall of the Storm Giants. Is very miserable to deal with, but it can close out the game with just 3 turns by itself. Some decks run 4. Some decks, I've even seen run the red one as well, just to in the turns one, and not even the gold spend dragons or the smoldering eggs, and really just get value out of their lands and taking those turns, and then it closes out the game in no time. You have really good bounce spells right now with Fading Hope and Divide by Zero. I've seen the 5 mana creature that then allows you to cast cards from your graveyard be played here as a 1-of to give you even more, just even more value. If people ever did decide to try to run a mid-range deck or a control deck, they have absolutely zero chance of combating something like the Is It Dragon. So what I'm saying here is that 2 other curve decks are really being enabled by Is It Dragons because of how well Is It Dragons just fends off against any of the other strategies that could exist if this deck did not exist in Standard, or if we had a better tools to actually combat against it. We could see some mid-range decks that could easily eat up those curve decks. I mean, curve decks traditionally do get beat by mid-range decks, by control decks, by decks that can just go bigger or go wider or just stop their early curve aggression. All right, so with that preface being said, now that we're almost 10 minutes in the video, let's get to my top 10 cards that I think would make great additions. Oop, there, I just spoiled my first one, to the Standard. So one other thing I've noted, I've looked, if you take away these tier decks here, you start to scratch the surface after that. They're just dominated by tokens. There are so many tokens in this format, whether it be, then that's, I guess the other way is Mass Exhibition is a very typical card for some of these learned decks to go and tutor up, and then it's another 3-for-1 that goes late game and whatnot. So I think having more answers to tokens is something that I think would be very good in the meta. And so the first one I'm going to pick is Echoing Truth. And you're going to see a lot of these cards that are going to be very similar. So this is just a card that returns target non-land permanent. All their permanents that share the same name as that permanent. So it's a great answer versus tokens. Yes, it could make dragons even better at that point because they can... And it also is very good against those curve decks because if they do, play two of the same one drops, it's a way to get back ahead and to kind of slow down those curve decks. And I think that some of these control decks, like it'd be Azorius or Grixis or any of these blue control decks, could really use Echoing Truth. The deck that I like to play would definitely like Echoing Truth because it would be a very good card in kind of the Dimir tempo shell that I play at the moment. And it would give you answers for all those tokens, or the Esket Chariots start to duplicating all those tokens, and it's just, it's just a mess sometimes when they really get ahead with those tokens, especially when they duplicate the Renin 7 token. So Echoing Truth, I think, would be a good addition. I don't think it's too powerful for Standard. That's a lot of these cards that Wizards hasn't reprinted in Standard right now are very lackluster now in the scope of things. We're seeing a lot of cards like a Braid. I'm trying to think of some other ones that exist in Standard at the moment that actually don't even see play right now. And these were powerhouses in their respective standards, and they don't even see play. Let's go on to the next one. My number 9 is going to be the Detention Sphere. So very similar. So this is something Azorius would have. It can get rid of the tokens. It can get rid of a problematic, Planeswalker. There are once you get past the top 3 decks, you see a lot of Blood on the Snow where it starts recurring cards from the graveyard. I think Detention Sphere would be fine. There are a lot of answers for Detention Sphere. There are plenty of answers right now. Green has plenty of answers. White has answers for destroying enchantments that are just tacked on to other creatures at the moment. And this isn't something that I think would be... it'd just be a great token sweeper and also have access to get rid of problematic cards. And it's one of those cards that does slow down those curve-based strategies. It's another card that could hit 2 Goldspan Dragons, for example, and then it could be very far ahead at that point with the Detention Sphere. The next one that I think would be a great addition would be the Incendiary Flow. So I chose this one over something like Lightning Strike. It's not instant speed, it's sorcery speed, so there's a little bit of liability there. But we don't have a lot of direct damage spells to the face. We have a lot of ways to do damage to creatures, and we even have ways to exile creatures. But we don't have a Lightning Strike in the format right now. We need a 3 damage spell. That would actually help aggro-based burn decks. You always need a burn deck in Standard to keep things fair. I think a burn deck would actually do very well against Izzet Dragons. I don't think it'd do very well against mono white or mono green because those two strategies typically do well versus burn because they're going to establish these threats that burn's going to have a hard time keeping up with, and then it will just go over the top of them. So Incendiary Flow would be great though for if a control deck were to come out. It just does what you need to do. It exiles cards. There are a lot of, like I mentioned, if you do go past the tier 1 decks and you start to get a tier 2, a lot of them are just getting so much value out of their graveyard. And so this is a card that would actually stop those graveyard-based recursion decks and be able to exile those problematic creatures that just keep getting kind of juggled back and forth from the graveyard. Alrighty, on to my number 7. My number 7 is the Ghost Quarter. Yes, we do have the other land that can do this, but I think Ghost Quarter, just being able to do it with 0 mana, just by sacrificing it, would be very, very good. It allows you to, how many Fabled, or not Fabled, what is the card I'm thinking of? The Frost, so all the manlands, being able to destroy, and instant speed without having to dump more mana into it, I think would be very, very good for Ghost Quarter. So Ghost Quarter, it also might make a land destruction deck viable. Like there's the Saga out of Kaldheim that wants to puts out trolls for how many lands are in the graveyard. I think that'd be another one you could run in that base strategy, and maybe that would be something that could be run. I think Ghost Quarter, another way to combat the manlands, is something we need because every deck is running manlands, and I think we need more answers to them. Thankfully, we do have a few answers right now, but I think more the merrier. The more options would be great for combating that sort of mess that we have in Standard with how aggressive those lands are. On to my number 6. My number 6 is going to be Inquisition of Kozilek. Now, hear me out. Everything else has increased. All the power level of creatures and spells, like take a look at these spells and how powerful they are, and how many of them are actually seeing Legacy play, like Expressive Iteration or Memory Deluge, like to be able to catch back up. The draw is so good right now in Standard. It is insane. The draw is very, very good. The value of the creatures is very, very good. We need cards like Inquisition to kind of slow these down. They can catch back up. I don't think that we're going to be dominated by a black disruption deck. I don't think that that's going to be the case if Inquisition were in the mix, or like a Dimir control deck. I don't think that would be the problem by putting Inquisition. I do think the Inquisition is desperately needed right now to rip out something like a Werewolf Pack Leader, or rip out something like a Luminarchus Aspirin on turn number 1s. You don't have to always feel like you're behind, and always feeling like you have to answer, and then just get beat down by manlands, or get beat down by the one creature that the creatures are so strong right now that every one of them feels like a Tarmogoyf. Everyone feels like it can close out the game if with just a few turns if you leave it up. So being able to Inquisition that and give you some breathing room, I think would be very, very good. You can also run it against, it wouldn't feel like it'd be a wasted card versus something like Is It Dragons. You can still rip out an Expressive Iteration, and I think we need that first turn, rip something out, and being able to give these mid-range decks, or these control decks, a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of time to set up before inevitably these curve decks, or these take extra turn decks get established. So I do think the Inquisition of Kozilek is something that is very necessary in Standard, and it's actually not like backbreaking. That the power level of this is just on par with other cards that already exist in Standard at the moment. On to my number 5. My number 5 is Rest in Peace. Again, once we scratch the surface once we take those tier 1 decks down, we're going to have to deal with the juggling decks. There are so many of them now, whether it be clerics or zombies or Blood in the Snow decks, that just recur from the graveyard. We do have some good answers. We have a lot of like Relic of Progenitus type artifacts. There's 2 of them I can think of in the format at the moment. But having this Rest in Peace would be very, very good. It also does shut off a lot of dying effects. There is plenty of dying effects that are kind of annoying or obnoxious right now in Standard, and Rest in Peace would be the perfect card for it. I think that these type of cards need to exist. Like, these should be evergreen type cards. We should always have the Pithing Needles, the Rest in Pieces, the Scavenging Oozes, just to combat these type of graveyard recursion based strategies. I'm very, very shocked actually that we don't have some of these cards that just hose these all-in type strategies right now with Innistrad and Crimson Vow, and even like Kaldheim. A lot of these decks did utilize the graveyard quite extensively, and we just don't have a lot of answers right now for them. Alrighty, on to my number 4. My number 4 is Lilias Triumph, or this could be any 2-mana spell. So right now we have Soul Shatter. This does have the added ability of hitting Planeswalkers. Lilias Triumph type card, instant speed, make opponent sacrifice a creature. This is basically because of Is It Dragons. It's good versus mono white and mono green. It's fine. It makes them get rid of their worst creature that they have out. Oftentimes it will just be a token, but versus Is It Dragons, if you can get rid of I cannot stand Goldspan Dragon. Goldspan Dragon is just such an unfun card to play against. It's basically a 3-mana spell. So Goldspan Dragon has Flying Haste, 4/4 for 5 mana, but leaves back a treasure as soon as it attacks and as soon as it becomes a target of a spell. And so if you do have to use removal, they still get 2 mana immediately to then they could cast a counter spell off it, like a Jizwara Disruption or a Test of Talents. Or they can just simply Fading Hope it back to their hand, and then even have even more mana after that. And then if it actually gets to attack, they get even more value. You're going to be dealing with a lot of mana. So it often feels like Goldspan Dragon is just 3 mana for a 4/4 haste, because the value you're getting off those treasures is going to either ramp into an Auron's Epiphany or something else, or it's going to cast an additional value out of like Memory Deluge to get back even more threats. And so having them sacrifice it before it gets any value, I think, is pivotal. And the difference between 2 and 3 mana is huge right now in Standard. So I really, really think that a card like Lilias Triumph would be very good. Oh, and the other thing, besides Is It Dragon, is Hall of the Storm Giants, where having Hexproof 7/7 land, making them sacrifice it. That's why, and it gets around Soul Shatter, because oftentimes they could have something else out that has a bit more mana cost. In this deck, usually not, but they get to choose, right, with Soul Shatter, or which one they do, because it goes by mana cost. So if they have like a bird out, they could sacrifice it anyway. So instead of Hall of the Storm Giants, I just think that having these things to be able to, make opponent sacrifice a creature would be good at 2 mana. I like the Liliana one because it is kind of relevant, because there is the Liliana in the format right now. So that could be kind of fun to actually play with the Liliana. That actually doesn't see a lot of play right now. The Professor Onyx doesn't see a lot of play right now in Standard, which is kind of a powerful card. All right, so on to my number three. My number three is Thought Distortion. Now we're getting into the really good ones. So up to this point, like, it's kind of cards I think would be good. Thought Distortion would be amazing versus Is It Dragons. So this is one of the cards that is desperately needed to combat Is It Dragons. Get up to 6 mana, get rid of their entire hand of non-creature spells, get rid of their graveyard for all the Memory Deluges and everything else that is the Galvanic copy spell that have been building up in their graveyard. Make it so they can't go that other alternative option of then going the creature that allows you to cast spells from your graveyard. Get rid of them. Gone, done, out of it. Can't be countered. 6 mana. Hose those type of all-in strategies with spells. It also is, if we do dumb down the power level of the Is It Dragons, we're going to inevitably see a bunch of these other control-based decks that are just going to try to outvalue with Memory Deluge. Memory Deluge needs Thought Distortion as an answer. It's going to be a problem if like you scratch those tier 1s and into the tier 2s. That's what you're going to start to see is a lot of these extreme value control decks that the Thought Distortion is going to do a good job of getting rid of them. Even Blood in the Snow decks, this is super good against because they're going to be running a lot of Planeswalkers that then they're going to recur with Blood in the Snow. Boom, Thought Distortion out. Get rid of their graveyard. People are playing. What's the Mind Rot card that also exiles graveyard? They're playing that one because of how obnoxious the graveyard is right now. So Thought Distortion is something that I wish was in standard. Up to this point, this is where we really start getting into the juicy stuff. All right, so on to my number 2. So what's better than the Thought Distortion? How about just ripping a specific card out of their library? So the problem with that one's Epiphany is they can get it out. They can put it into their exile with Foretell, but at least you can rip out the other copies. Or if there's another problematic card, we are, as I mentioned before, once you get past the tier 1 strategies, then you're into Blood in the Snow, you're into Meat Massacre type decks that are really, really, they need those cards to survive. If you slaughter games, those specific recursion cards or those specific wipes that also end up being their finishers, then they have a hard time being able to then come back from them. So it's a one-trick pony with those particular cards. Slaughter Games is great answer for those particular cards. And it doesn't have to be Slaughter Games. It could be Lost Legacy. It could be Necromentia. This is actually funny because we typically have had these type of cards in standards that didn't want them. And now we finally do want them. And we don't have one. There isn't one in standard right now. So I don't care what it would be. If we could just get one of these black cards that can name a card, rip it out, we could get rid of all these all-in decks that just use like 1 or 2 win conditions. In fact, I'd actually like what's it is, Sadistic Sacrament, I think is the card that has kicker. It allows you to just go get 3 cards out of their library. That'd be pretty good too against these particular decks. It's a non-basic land that you can go grab. I actually think you can grab bait. You can land just any cards with Sadistic Sacrament. And you could get 3 cards out of their library. It makes it a lot harder for them to then they'd have to utilize a more diverse win con package after that. So desperately wanting one of these particular cards. All right, so that leads us to my number 1. And this one might surprise you because it actually doesn't affect any of the tier decks, but like I've mentioned over and over in this rant, is once Is It Dragons gets taken care of, once we have some sort of options for that, we are going to be dominated by tokens, because tokens do very well against the mono green and the mono white. So just spitting out a ton of tokens and valuing it, whether it be like the Mass Exhibition, like the Sorin, not Sorin, but Edgar Markov vampire tokens that come out. There are a lot of wolf tokens and zombie tokens, things like that. Are what's the planeswalker that throws out the insect tokens? Tokens. There are so many stinking tokens. Everything throws out tokens. I think Brilliant Plague would be very good right now in standard. So creature tokens get -2, -2, stops the Esca Chariot, stops the wolves coming out, stops all that nonsense. And then people have to utilize something besides tokens to then finish off the game. So I don't know how important this card would be, but it would give us those answers to those particular decks. And that's what Magic is all about. Magic's all about tuning decks and finding the right number of cards to combat things. And we have some goodies right now in standard now as far as the ability to Abrade is very good if an artifact ever came into prominence that really made it tough to compete against it. I think that these three particular hate cards, the ripping out cards from the library, the getting rid of tokens, as well as what was the other one? Oh, the thought collapse. Just being able to exile an all-in spells type deck would be very, very important for standard. So interested in what ones you think would be good for standard, or if you just completely hate my list. Yeah, I didn't pick any cards of like, oh, this particular Shell just needs like an enchantment-based deck and just needs an ethereal armor type card. Like, yeah, that'd be interesting to look at those type of cards. Like, there definitely is cards that I do miss right now that I wish, like, I wish that champion of this, the Citizens champion were in standard at the moment. Unfortunately, it's not. And because I think an enchantment deck would be quite good in standard. Yeah, those I didn't pick those particular cards. I picked hate cards that I think could deal with kind of the boogeyman, which is it dragons and other cards that would show up. So I hate this deck. I absolutely hate is it dragons or is it spells. I wish they would. If I were to ban cards right now, it'd just be Alrund's Epiphany. Get rid of it. It's just an unfun card. The Foretell pushes it over the top. It's just a bad mechanic with it, with not being able to then duress it out or get rid of it. They can just set that up early, and then eventually they're going to be able to get so much value out of Alrund's Epiphany. Where you put just I think they thought that 2/1/1 flyers would then just be something that could help be defensive or something, when then it ends up being where you can copy it and, wow, okay, I can take a few extra turns, animate a Hall of the Storm Giant, just win the game. Just get to 7 mana and win. That's what this particular deck feels like. So hate this card. And I also think Goldspan Dragon is just in a classification of its own. I think this card is just too powerful for standard. And it just warps. I do not like treasures, and then when you make treasures be able to add 2 mana, it just makes your big draw spells so good. Or there are a lot of 4, 5, 6, 7 mana spells that are just unplayable right now because they need to do something bigger than like the Goldspan Dragon does, and they don't. And this card is just really, really potent for what it does for just 5 mana. So it's just crowding out a lot of design spaces, crowding out a lot of these slots that could exist, a lot of cards that could be played that people are not even considering because of how powerful this card can just take over the game with the ability to just generate so much mana. Not a fan of treasures. I'm not a fan of putting Lotus Petal on every card. So things like the Shambling Ghoul and the Deadly Dispute and you name it, all those cards that create treasures. I don't know if I like treasures because treasures not only help you fix in colors, you can go like 4 or 5 colors, no problem if you have like a treasure-based deck, but it's just the amount of being able to ramp, the amount of value of just slapping on Lotus Petals. It wasn't an issue in Ixalan when they put it on like 3 mana or higher spells, but when they started slapping it on 1 mana, 2 mana on a 5/5 or 4/4 dragon for 5 mana, yeah, it becomes a problem with these treasures, so not a fan of those. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video of my top 10 cards that I wish existed in standard to combat kind of the menace that we have right now. Interested in your list in the comment section below. And I'm still looking for ideas for brew decks. Like, the thing is, I have some decks I'm working on. I need to get back to my roots for Rogue Deck Builder of just taking a card and seeing how far I can push it. I've tried some few unsuccessful cards. It's really, really tough to brew right now when you have on the one end like a curve, lose on turn 4, base strategies versus mono white and mono red, or mono white and mono green, and then on the other end of the spectrum you have get to 7 mana, lose the game against Is It Dragons. So it's very, very tough to kind of brew synergy decks at the moment, but we'll explore it down the road. I'm starting to get a little more time now to start building decks and brewing decks, and been obsessed with Limited. I think Limited has been very, very good. So Strixhaven Limited was fun. Both Crimson Vow and Innistrad Midnight Hunt were fun. Chaldean was fun. I think we've been spoiled with limited environments right now, and that's also been another reason why I haven't been going to the drawing board and really brewing these rogue decks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Kevin with Rogue Deck Builder. Thanks for watching.